If you have your Bibles, if you would turn with me to our passage for today, Acts chapter 20. At the beginning of the school year, Jane went back to teach part-time. And so I started to get a couple hours in the morning every day with our youngest daughter, Katie. And so I made this plan for us, for the two of us to go on these daily adventures. And so it worked out for about a week. But with my bike, pulling Kate in our bike trailer, we went on several of these adventures. We went out to Shadow Cliffs, and we went to the library, and we went to a park, and we went to a coffee shop. But these adventures came at a strange cost. I had to deceive my daughter. It had been a while since she had been pulled in the bike trailer, and she was just not going to do it. I got the bike out, got the bike trailer out, and she said, "It looks scary." I tried to bribe her. I tried to make a big deal about where we were going. She loved Shadow Cliff. She loves the library. I tried threatening consequences. None of it worked until I started to encourage just sort of baby steps. How about you just sit in it? I won't ride anywhere. So she sat in it for a few minutes and got comfortable. How about I go super slow and you can tell me to stop at any moment? So she said, okay. And I started to ride. I said, do you want me to start riding to Shadow Cliffs? I'll go super slow. And she said, okay, but only if you go super slow. So I start to make my way towards Shadow Cliffs. I start to speed up a little bit. Mostly I'm just trying to get, it's not that long of a distance from our house to a bike path where we're not on roads anymore, and I just wanted to get off the road with her. And so I started to pick up speed, and I hear Katie call out from the back, "Daddy, are we going super slow?" "Yeah, sweetie, we're going super slow." "Okay, good," is what she says from the back. But the crazy thing was, we were definitely not going super slow. We were going significantly faster, and there was a part of me that felt dishonest. But I also had an idea. And for the whole ride, that first day, I played around with my speed and with her acceptance of what we were doing. I would slow down, but I would tell her we were going faster, and she would immediately say, "No faster, Daddy. I want to go super slow." And I was going super slow. And at one point, I was pedaling as fast as I could, and I called back to her, "I love going super slow." And she called up, "I love going super slow too. This is so fun." I discovered that there was more going on here than just a parenting experiment. Kate was willing to do anything, as long as I assured her that the conditions were to her liking, that they met her expectations for safety. It was clear to me that she knew that they weren't, but she didn't want to know. Right? The saying, "ignorance is bliss," comes to mind. Kate was unconcerned with the facts. Slow, fast, safe, unsafe. The facts made no difference. She wanted to feel safe, which meant she needed to believe that we were going slow, which meant I was on the hook for telling her what she needed to hear in order to believe that. She does the same thing on swings, actually. "Are you pushing me super high?" "No," I lie. "Okay, good. This is so fun." And it's fun for her as long as she thinks that she's not going super high. So on full display in my 3-year-old is the comforting power of ignorant belief. And in me, the power for a trusted voice to help someone continue to believe in ignorance. I mean, this kind of willful ignorance that we choose, is alive and well in our culture. And not just in children, but in adults, and often in Christian adults. This morning, we're going to look at this willful ignorance and consider the danger that it poses to us. The danger of being lulled to sleep in our faith. The heart of our passage this morning is a warning to the elders of a church. These overseers of the church are being called on to protect the church from the sort of willful ignorance that would allow them to fall asleep in the faith, forgetting the grace of God, forgetting their call. And so as the story picks up for us, right in verse 17, Paul has been hurrying through the region on his way to Jerusalem. He's trying to get there to celebrate Pentecost. But he wants to reconnect with the elders of the church in Ephesus. See, this is a church that he has a deep connection with. This is the church that he spent over 3 years in this city, and these leaders spent years meeting with Paul night and day, learning the way of Jesus. There are disciples in this town, in this community, who were so committed to Jesus, so convinced that Jesus was worthy of their trust and loyalty, that they brought all of their expensive magic books to be burned, never to be trusted in again. These are the same disciples who rejected idols as not real and caused rioting among the people in Ephesus. Paul was there through all of this. Paul was leading these people, building this church up so that they might make these kinds of acts of faith. These are the elders that he's with now. And in verse 18, Paul speaks with people who share a deep history with him. He says, "You yourselves know how I lived among you the whole time from the first day that I set foot in Asia, serving the Lord with all humility and with tears and with trials that happened to me through the plots of the Jews." Paul will not let these church leaders forget what they've been through together. And he won't let them forget who he has been for them. I don't know about you, but I have a hard time reading this without feeling Paul's words grind against the grain of my expectations, right? It tends to make probably most of us uncomfortable when people start talking about all of the things that they have done for God. It's even more unsettling when people start talking about how humble they are. But Paul doesn't make any of this about himself. In verse 21, he makes it clear there's something much bigger at stake here. He's reminding them that everything he did was all so that they would turn their hearts and their lives toward God, and that they would live with an abiding trust in Jesus as Lord. And even now, he reminds them of his own faithfulness among them as a way of calling them to also remain faithful to God, to keep trusting, to keep following Jesus. Paul publicly puts his life where his mouth is, right? He doesn't want to just tell people, this is who you should be. But he says to them, this is who you can be. Look at me. I'm a living example of God's grace and God's Spirit transforming a life. Imitate me. In our day, this seems like one of the most ridiculous things you could do. The moment a politician announces that they're running for office, the dirt starts getting dug, right? There are elaborate vetting processes to make sure candidates have nothing to hide. And yet, over and over again, politicians write memoirs. They stand up and they tell stories about themselves that others who were there go, well, not exactly. It didn't happen quite like that. Let's correct the record. In verse 31, Paul's finished speaking. He's finished saying, this is who you have seen me be. And nobody raises a hand to say, you weren't that humble. No. They cried together and they prayed together. To me, in this passage, the most amazing thing is not that Paul describes himself as a humble, suffering servant who denied himself, working hard, all so that he could preach and teach night and day. That's pretty incredible. But the more amazing thing to me is that these elders who knew him, who were with him for so many of those nights and days, don't correct him. Apparently, he's speaking the truth. This is who he has been among them for 3 years. 3 years is a long time to pretend. This seems to be who Paul is. Paul speaks the truth to them. And for Paul, the truth must be remembered. The facts matter. Paul can't afford for the people to forget what he went through and what he taught them. If they do forget, they will be tempted to avoid suffering. If they forget, they will begin to twist what is true. And they will begin to draw others away from Paul's example, away from Jesus and away from God. And so be alert is what Paul calls out. Remember. Otherwise, your natural desires will begin to rise up and take over. You will listen to your fear when you feel unsafe. You will listen to your discontentment when you feel that you should have more and bigger stuff. You will listen to your hatred when you feel justified in seeking revenge. And you will begin to believe that you must protect yourself. You must provide for yourself. You must get justice for yourself. And in each of these, the truth will have been twisted. You will have accepted a different truth. And if you must do these things for yourself, protect yourself, provide for yourself, get justice for yourself, then there is no place for God in your life. And you will be on your way toward falling asleep. Starting in verse 28, Paul begins to mix his metaphors a bit. He draws on several First Testament ideas and symbols in order to sort of lay out the warning good and thick. He says, pay attention, which calls to mind the city watchmen of the First Testament who were to carefully keep an eye on the city perimeter looking for enemies. And then he expands this to include the work of a shepherd looking over his flock. And then there's the call to be alert, or stay awake, requiring active effort to keep one's attention on what God is doing. And finally, there is just the word remember. Over and over again, the Israelites turn from God in the stories of the First Testament. And the reason they turn over and over again is said that they have failed to remember. They have failed to remember who God is. They have failed to remember what God has done. They have failed to remember what God has promised to do. Remember. Paul warns the Ephesian elders with the First Testament. These Ephesians know what God has done among them. Paul says, you have seen what God has done among you. And they nod with him. They know of the good news of God's grace. They have received it and are walking in it. They know what it looks like to give your life to the service, in service to this good news. They have seen it in Paul and they have heard it from him. And the Ephesians cannot choose ignorance, or else they will be drawn away. And this warning is as necessary today as it ever has been. A few years ago, a woman attended our Good Friday service, a service specifically focused on the death of Jesus. And afterward, she asked me why I talked so much about death, that she was really looking for a happy service to sort of get a boost for Easter. And I tried to explain to her that the resurrection only makes sense. It only means anything if we're honest about the death of Jesus. Holy Week, the amount of space the Gospels devote to describing the death of Jesus, they require us, they demand that we look at the death of Jesus, that we meditate on it, that we seek to understand what it means. But she just quickly dismissed me and said that there's enough death in the world. The church should be a place where we think about positive stuff so that we can feel better about our lives. Like Kate in the bike trailer, this woman wanted to feel safe and good about the conditions of her life. And to do so, she asked me to deceive her. She wants someone to tell her that God is making all things new. And it's not going to cost us anything. The church celebrates Holy Week as part of our calendar, as part of the rhythm of our year, so that we can stay alert, so that we can remember every year what it cost God to redeem his creation. Paul says it in verse 28, be on guard, care for the church of God, which God purchased with his own blood. When Jesus told his disciples, if you want to follow me, you must take up your crosses and come after me, he was calling to those whose freedom he purchased to imitate him, to do as he did. You can see where faith gets misplaced. See, for Kate, riding in the bike and the bike trailer, she wanted to trust that her speed made her safe. But what she needed to trust, and she's got lots of years, so hopefully this will happen, she needed to trust in my desire to keep her safe in the trailer. And for this woman, she wanted to trust that by ignoring death, by focusing on the positive, that death somehow lost its power over us. It lost its ability to make the world a negative place. What she needed to trust was God's ability and his promise to raise the dead. Death has lost its power. Not because we become skilled at pretending it doesn't exist. Death has lost its power only because Jesus was willing to submit himself to it in order to show that not even death could thwart God's restoration project. That God could overcome even death, the thing that humans fear more than anything. In the earliest churches, there were already those who wanted to reject death and suffering as a legitimate path. The 12 disciples in the Gospels wanted to reject death and suffering as a legitimate path. And Paul warns us that if we forget the cross, if we forget the suffering of Jesus, we too will find ways to avoid suffering. We will look for easier paths. We will look for paths of self-fulfillment. We'll look for paths of empire and ego building. We'll look for paths of self-preservation. The story about Good Friday reminds me of a friend of mine. I've told you guys this story before, but I think it's worth remembering on this morning. But my friend is a pastor, and a couple years ago, his wife was feeling intense pain in her abdomen, and she'd had cancer that had gone into remission several years before, and she was convinced that this wasn't the cancer having come back. And together they sat in the doctor's office waiting for the doctor to return with her results. And as the doctor walked in, she asked to be excused for a moment, and then she walked out. And the doctor and my friend waited. And they waited. And they kept waiting. Finally, they realized that she was not coming back in. The doctor told him, my friend, that her cancer had come back. It was serious, and she didn't have long. As he went back out to the car, he found her sitting there. And before he could say anything, she just started to say, I told you that the ulcer had come back. And for her final months, she attributed all of her pain to minor ailments that she could deal with through various herbal remedies and home fixes. And she never admitted that she was sick. She never admitted that she was dying, and she never let her husband or her children say goodbye to her. She found comfort for herself in telling herself that She was going super slow, but it was a false comfort. A comfort rooted in willful ignorance. And it was a comfort that robbed others of the chance to walk with her toward a good and confident death. For Christians, hope doesn't come from denying the truth. Hope comes from standing on the real truth. The real truth is often difficult. It often costs us something, but it is real. Paul speaks the truth to the elders. Hard times are coming for the church in Ephesus. Outsiders will attack you. Insiders will try to break you up. The church will be tempted to choose easier paths directed by twisted gospels, and the church will be tempted to fall asleep. Don't let it, Paul says. Stay on guard. Be alert. Holy Week helps us remember in the rhythm of our year what God has done for us to make us his people. Advent helps us remember what God has yet to do for us. Most Advents, I was saying earlier, become about Christmas. And it makes sense because for 4 weeks, Advent leads up to Christmas. And there's so much about Christmas that is awesome and fun to celebrate. But historically, Advent has 2 purposes, and we often neglect the second purpose for the sentimentality of the first. We remember Christmas, remembering the first coming of Jesus. And when we do that, if we do that well, we use Advent to reflect on God's promises and God's faithfulness to fulfill those promises. So that when we sing a song like, O come, Emmanuel, we understand that we are giving voice to the deepest yearnings and cryings of a people who were in exile, longing to know and to believe that God was with them in terrible circumstances, that God was for them, that God intended to restore them. When we sing that song, we find ourselves in their place, understanding what it meant for Jesus to come, that Jesus was the fulfillment of a promise that had been given so long ago. Today, as we participate in Advent, we look forward as well. We look forward to God fulfilling his final promises. Today, we wait for Jesus, our King, to return. We wait for God's kingdom to have complete victory over all of the kingdoms of the earth. We wait for the new heavens and the new earth to be made. We wait for all things to be made new. These are the promises of God that we cling to. But while we wait, as our eyes are open, as we see things clearly, we recognize that there are terrible things taking place everywhere and all around us. There is war and there is rape. There is suicide and there is murder and terrorism. There is prejudice and hate. There is lust and greed. And everywhere we see the fingerprints of wickedness. We see creation rebelling against its good creator. And Advent reminds us that no matter how bad things appear to be, we must stay awake. We must stay alert. Advent reminds us that we are a people who are called to wait and to wait well. The kingdom that we pray for, that we long for, is a kingdom that right now we are participants in. What will God's kingdom look like on that final day when it comes and is established? Look at the church, and you ought to see it. Sure, it won't be perfect. It won't be without any sort of sin or blemish, but if the church will remember, if the church will keep remembering, if the church stays alert, then it will live as an embassy of God's kingdom. It will be a community of love, of sacrifice. It will be a community of peace and of peacemaking. It will be a community of hospitality, creating space for the neighbor and for the stranger and for the foreigner and for the enemy. The church, shining brightly, showing off God's kingdom, will announce in all places and will spread the good news of God's grace with passion and with conviction. Advent turns our eyes toward this kingdom and teaches us to wait for it. But waiting on God is never inactive. Waiting gives us the chance to see what God might want to do in the world and get in on that. So that as we imitate Jesus with our lives, as the church comes alongside those who suffer and suffers with them, the church will show off God's intention, will show off the beautiful kingdom that he longs to bring in its fullness to his creation. The church also has been called to show the world how to wait for God, how to long for his restoration, how to yearn for justice. And so Advent for us is a yearly season of training in patient attentiveness and hungry yearning for God. A friend of mine who studied somewhat extensively in the Jewish festivals once told me that we Americans and Christians in general have it backwards. The Jewish rhythm of fasting and festival is opposite what we do, right? So Thanksgiving starts our feasting season, and we feast all the way through to Christmas, and then we fast because we have to. New Year's comes, and we fast because we can't eat anymore, and because we don't like what we see on the scale, and because we know that our lives are in disarray, and so just there's been too much, and so we go into a season of fasting. This tends to be the way that we do it, right? We overindulge, and then we diet. The Jewish rhythm is fasting first. You fast in preparation so that on that feast day, you celebrate with appropriate gratitude and you don't overindulge because you're aware from all of that fasting exactly what you have, that it is a gift and that it is to be received well and for the Lord. And so Advent could be for us each year a way of teaching us to fast and to yearn well, to be patient. We can't let Advent be co-opted by the don't worry, be happy party planners, right? Where too much happy music, too much baby Jesus, too much simple faith, and we might just find ourselves in danger of falling asleep. That falling asleep piece is really interesting because there's one more interesting detail about the story of Kate in the bike trailer. So we made it to Shadow Cliffs, and we're on our way back after we had been playing for a while. It was time to leave. And once again, Kate was nervous to get back in. We'd gone on this long ride, but now again, she's looking at it like, not so sure. And she once again wanted to confirm with me that I was going to go super slow. And so when I said yes, she got in. But this time it was weird. She gripped the sides of the trailer and she hung on to them nervously for like 5 minutes. When she called up to me, she said, "Daddy, are you going to go super slow the whole way home?" And I said, "Of course, sweetie." Lying again. I'm confessing this to you. But that was the word that she needed. She let go of the sides, adjusted in her seat, and she fell asleep like that for the rest of the way home. Often, a twisted truth is all we need to let our guard down enough to fall asleep. It's interesting the way that Acts introduces Paul's speech to the Ephesian elders, right? Just as I told you a true story about my daughter that reveals a deeper spiritual truth, so too the author of Acts has told us a miracle story that, in light of Paul's speech, seems to also be about something much deeper. It's Paul's last night in a city called Troas. He's been there for a week, and the church has gathered for worship together late in the evening, teaching then late into the evening. This crowd is apparently eager to keep learning, except for young Eutychus. It's really late, midnight, and they're in this upper room, third floor, and there are lanterns. And if you know anything about kind of the construction of these types of places, these lanterns would have created a nice hazy smoke at the top of the room. And he is growing tired. Whether we don't know why he grows tired, he's just tired and he falls asleep. But falling asleep, it turns out, is dangerous business, especially when you're sitting in a windowsill on the third floor. And Eutychus falls out of the window and he falls to his death. And so Paul, like Peter before him and Jesus before him, raises a man from the dead. It's kind of a cool miracle. Eutychus is made alive. And the church gathers and worships together, remembering the Last Supper. And Paul keeps instructing the people until the sun comes up in the morning. You get that? From sundown, essentially, to sunrise. There's a crowd that want to keep learning, that are hungry to keep growing. And it says that all of the people were comforted by what happened with Eutychus. Side by side, the story of Eutychus sounds like a warning. Do not fall asleep. Which is then echoed throughout Paul's speech to the Ephesian elders. The people in Troas are comforted that Eutychus is alive and unhurt. But this comfort is not an ignorant comfort. It is comfort in the face of real death. They saw what happened to him. They are comforted in the face of truth. That if you fall asleep, you risk death. But for them, they see and are comforted by the grace of God. It says, if you fall asleep, God is able to wake you once again. Death, whether physical or spiritual, does not have the final word. And so, stay alert and do not fall asleep. There's one other part of the Christian calendar that actually is much more present in our lives than Advent and Christmas and Holy Week. And that is the first day, the Lord's Day. We're told at the beginning of the story about Eutychus that the church gathered on the first day of the week. It seems that this is the beginning of the church gathering on the first day of the week, because what happened on the first day of the week? Jesus was raised from the dead. And so, something happens for us when we orient our lives around this day. When we say the first day of the week, we will gather with God's people in order to turn our attention towards God. It says that above all else, above everything else, above every to-do list somebody gives us, above every set of priorities that somebody tries to lay on us, we say, we are a people of the cross and the resurrection. And so the first day of the week is essential for us. If we are to become like Jesus, if we are to follow him, the first day of the week is part of the rhythm of our lives, of remembering week after week that we are called to receive the grace of God and to be transformed by it. So that as we are sent out of this place, all of the other days become these opportunities for us to then extend the grace of God to the world, to announce the good news. And so this morning we come to the table. And as we do, we remember that we are called to be awake, to be alert. And so come to the table thinking, considering what it means to receive God's grace this morning. And come to the table considering what it means to wait patiently for God to fulfill his promises. That this bread and this cup come with Paul's words, that every time we take them, we proclaim the Lord's death until he returns. That we keep doing this. We keep doing this. We keep doing this, not so that it becomes rote, but so that we can learn to be attentive in the midst of all of the ordinary things of our lives, so that we can remember that it's Christ's death and resurrection that have given us life.